Welcome to the show. This is the Magician and the Fool podcast, episode number 67. My name is Dominic. I'm one of the co-hosts. The other host is Janus, and you'll hear from him in a minute. Today we had the absolute pleasure to speak with Mr. PD Newman regarding his new book on Theurgy, and what a great book it is. This isn't just a rehash of information you've probably seen before if you're interested in the topic. PD brings a lot of new ideas, new information to the table, and he makes a lot of interesting connections between the Neoplatonists, the Middle Platonists, the Chaldean oracles, the pre-Socratics, the Homeric epics, the Greek magical papyri, Mithraism, Egyptian alchemy, Asian shamanism, Gnosticism, and much more. It really is a great book on the subject. Before we jump into the episode, we'd like to say thank you to our Patreon supporters. As always, you are awesome. We appreciate your support. If you would like to also help support the show and keep the lights on and things running, feel free to head over to Patreon and do what is right for you. It does ensure that this work continues. We dedicate this to Hermes and Asclepius, and may any merits that we accumulate doing this work be distributed to all sentient beings, so that they together with us may equally realize awakening. Welcome to the show. We are really excited for this episode. We are here with Mr. PD Newman, author of the new book, Theurgy, Theory and Practice, The Mysteries of the Ascent to the Divine, Homeric Epics, the Chaldean Oracles, and Neoplatonic Ritual. Welcome to the show, PD.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, as we were talking before, a little bit before we started the recording, this is a book that we were really excited about, and after reading it, like I told you, I felt like I was your target audience. It really brought together a lot of different topics and pieces that really belong together, and you really did an excellent job.
Yeah, thank you. It was absolutely a labor of love.
Nice. Yeah, I put this up there as, one of my favorite books that recently came out was Wouter Hanegraaff's book on Hermeticism, and this is a great compliment to that, actually.
That's a high compliment.
Yeah, no.
If I ever heard one.
Cool, man. So let's jump in. So just to kind of get oriented, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in this topic and how this all came about, and then we'll run from there.
Sure. Yeah. I grew up in the South, moved around a lot, but in and around my preteen years, I really started getting into psychedelics, which is frankly really what opened all these doors to me, what opened my eyes to all of this phenomena. And it wasn't until I guess I was around 18, maybe closer to 20, I started really taking an interest in rites of passage, which is sorely lacking in our culture. But in the South, we have the benefit of Freemasonry being very prevalent. And really, I had no idea where to turn. And so I just kind of took a chance with Freemasonry. And that is what really got me thinking in terms of ritual, of proper ritual, and how rites of passage work. And there's a Masonic Rosicrucian organization that goes way back. It's based on the very first Rosicrucian order to surface after the initial publication of the Rosicrucian manifestos. And this was a German organization der Ordens des Gold- und Rosenkreuz. And this Masonic organization is kind of, it's not identical to that, but it's largely based on that. And once I got involved with that, my interests in other magical organizations such as the Golden Dawn and the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, things like that, got me really interested in magical ritual, not just rites of passage. And so I spent, a couple of decades just digesting grimoires, magical texts. And if you're familiar with the Solomonic grimoires, they will refer to themselves as theurgy, as being theurgic ritual. But I couldn't shake the fact that when I would look to actual theurgic texts, books written by Neoplatonists who were practicing theurgists, and looking at the Chaldean grimoires, they're nothing alike. And so I was really kind of faced with the problem of what does real theurgy look like? And so I decided to just kind of start with the basics. And I started with Plato. And it wasn't until I got introduced to the pre-Socratics that I realized that what Plato was doing was really a spin on what the pre-Socratics were already doing. So I kind of took a step back, investigated the pre-Socratics, and I'm glad I did, because it really helped me understand what the Neoplatonists were doing. I think Neoplatonists like Iamblichus, for example, has more in common with people like Empedocles and Parmenides than he does with his Platonic predecessors. And it was just a chance encounter with a reference in one of those texts that pointed to where I could find what the actual ritual looked like. And that ended up being in a book by Proclus, who was Iamblichus's successor. And he wrote a commentary on Plato's Republic. And in that commentary, he comes to a part where he's trying to defend Homer and Hesiod from the claims of Socrates in Plato's book that these ancient poets, they have to be done away with, because in the Republic, he's trying to tell how a perfect republic would look. And the fact that the gods do things according to these poets that we would deem amoral, or they murder. There's lots of things we would call amoral. And Socrates says, and I think he says it ironically, that we have to do away with this and write new myths for the Athenian youth. And that's when Proclus says, this is absolutely not correct, and that the more amoral a myth appears is an indication of really how transcendent it is, because they invite the reader to look deeper, and that's where things are kind of encoded in these works, allegedly. And that's what he does. He goes back to his teacher, Syrianus, and tells how Syrianus interpreted this one section in Homer's Iliad. And that turns out to be, he says, if this is mimicked with a living person, the ritual itself is a funeral ritual. He says, if this is done with a living person, that's what theurgy is. That's what it looks like. And so that was really a revelation to me. And I was really fascinated with his decision, or Syrianus's decision, to project this teaching into Homer, because I had recently read Porphyry's on the Cave of the Nymphs, which is a commentary on an esoteric commentary on the meaning of a chapter in Homer's Odyssey. So I found it really fascinating that for both the theory, because Porphyry really, he's the first person who lays out the theory behind it step by step. For both the theory and the practice, it was discussed in terms of Homer. And of course, theurgy as such doesn't emerge until the 2nd century after Christ. So
can I pause you for a minute to ask you
sure.
something? So it sounds like what you're saying is that after studying Porphyry inspired you to use Syrianus as a theurgic hermeneutic on Homer?
Well, it was Proclus whose teacher was Syrianus, and
I'm sorry,
yep,
Proclus. Yeah,
and
that's what I meant. My
that's
head.
fine. Um,
I'm the dumb one. So
It's true.
the the writings of Syrianus are sparse. I believe all that survives is a couple of books of him commenting on Aristotle's metaphysics, and but he was a theurgist. I believe he was taught theurgy by Plutarch of Athens, and it was Plutarch of Athens' granddaughter, if I'm not mistaken, who initiated Proclus into theurgy. So the implication is that this ritual they're discussing is what was done to them. That there is just like Hanegraaff kind of talks about, that there is a small circle of initiates that are actually doing this kind of thing one-on-one, and it's not just ritual theory, which is kind of the impression you get when researching theurgy, if it's not discussed in terms of the European grimoires or in terms of an application of traditional Greek religion and household religion. You don't really see what the practice is. And I can understand why, because, like I said, it's buried in a commentary on Plato's Republic, which, I mean, I don't know how many people are reading Plato today, much less commentaries on his work by obscure Neoplatonists. But yes, it was in Proclus that really made me say, okay, this is a real thing. This is a real practice. It's not just theory laid out saying, if we did this and if it was done, it would probably look like this. It's as close as we're going to get to being told what theurgy is by someone who was doing it.
Awesome. Yeah, and there is some really interesting insight from Proclus on that commentary of the Republic, where he talks about essentially the divine chain of beings, and how they connect to Homer, and when the gods were acting in these very human ways, perhaps this was more of the daemonic representation of the gods rather than the highest form of the gods themselves, and things like that. And I really like the attention that you've given to Porphyry in your book. I feel like a lot of people kind of dismiss him as kind of the grumpy boomer teacher of Iamblichus, but and I don't remember if you mention it in your book, but I've always been of the opinion that I didn't think that Iamblichus and Porphyry were really at odds to the degree that people really portray that relationship being. What's your thought on that?
I think that for the most part, they're in agreement. They are at odds in the same way that Iamblichus was at odds with Plotinus. And that was Plotinus's concept of the undescended soul, that part of the soul is always connected to the divine, and you can't ever unconnect that. And that was one issue, one thing that Iamblichus really took issue with, because he said that to really understand man's purpose and man's station in this web of creation, man has to be where he is. We serve the purpose of being a kind of bridge between nature and the daemons, and the daemons are kind of the bridge between us and the gods. So if we're not really down here in this body doing this stuff that humans do, then Iamblichus really felt that it's not, that there's no point in it, and Porphyry was really invested in what Plotinus had said. And Plotinus is a notoriously difficult read. His Enneads they're often, I think in his mind, he was making it as clear as possible, but the way his mind works, he was so brilliant. And it's such a large collection of works that you do get the impression a couple of times that he's contradicting himself. But I think there are nuances to this that we're only just really figuring out how to tease out and understand the context some of these things are said in. But he does seem to imply that the soul part of it remains with the one. And Proclus solves this problem by discussing the one in the soul. And he gives us this impression when he talks about the hypostases, which are the Platonic equivalent to what we might call the Holy Trinity. But there's the monad, which is the one. Then beneath this is the nous, or the mind, the intellect of the one, and then psyche, or soul, the soul of the one. And then below that we have matter. And the way Proclus looked at it, which I thought was kind of brilliant, is that means that the ground on which matter stands is soul, and the ground on which soul stands is intellect, and the ground on which intellect stands is the one. So that means naturally that at the base of each of these phenomena is the one before it, or the two before it, or the three before it, if we're looking at nature. Mm-hmm. So his idea of the one in the soul was his way of solving that problem, but they do seem to be at odds in that regard.
Yeah, and that is a real well put, and that is really a brilliant take on Proclus's part, because can you really separate these things and draw hard lines? And it seems as though they are very intertwined, mm-hmm. and not really as separate as we'd like to intellectually kind of portray them as being.
Or we could even say that they're contingent upon one another and interdependent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Proclus had this idea of, reversion, that there's the projection and then reversion of the energies that come from each of these. So when the one, it kind of overflows, it's in its fullness. Well, at some point that overflow reverts upon itself. And when it does, intellect is created. And when intellect overflows, its reversion is soul. And so it really is this one continuous flow, almost kind of like a fountain, or if it's kind of difficult to visualize, but I see something like a fountain, a tiered fountain.
Mm-hmm. And in Gnosticism, this is essentially what's being discussed when they're talking about the unlimited benevolence of the Father. Mm-hmm. The flowing forth of the pleroma from the paternal depth.
Right. And pleroma, of course, it means that divine fullness.
Right. And you see similar things in Hermetism, which makes sense because they are connected by, through Platonism. So let's back up a minute and ask the question about theurgy itself. And if you can define that for us, contrasting it with maybe what you were discussing earlier as far as Goetia, sorcery, what are the differences, similarities?
There's a lot of similarities in terms of the practices, but the goals are different and the models can change. But theurgy, I think, is best understood when placed against liturgy. Liturgy most people think of like Orthodox liturgy, which is the Catholic, and Catholicism, it's called the Mass, but in Orthodox Christianity, they call it the Divine Liturgy. And that's fine. We can talk about it in terms of that, because I think it's most easily comprehended that way. But liturgy basically means the work of the people. It means the public working. And the implication is that public working is with God or with the gods. Whereas theurgy, it means the work of the gods. Basically, it's a combination of two Greek words that mean deity and work. So it could mean the work of the gods. It could mean to work with the gods. But my way of approaching it is saying, well, liturgy is God's work with the people, whereas theurgy is one man's work with God or the gods. Because the ultimate goal of theurgy is union. It could be union with the daemon. It could be with the demiurge. It could be with the one, depending on how high the individual is climbing on this ladder. But that's also what we see in the Orthodox liturgy. They're communing, it's called communion, because they're communing with the God through theophagy, through eating the God. And this notion of eating the God is present even in theurgy, and it's even present, as Walter Burkert points out, in traditional Greek religion, when they sacrifice an animal that's sacred to a specific deity. The tendency is to then eat that animal and commune with the god as that animal, because their worldview is there's nothing secular for them. The Egyptians had a similar way of looking at the world. Everything is sacred, everything is divine. So when
and even the Orphic perspective, embraces that attitude. And what you're describing is so essential, because in the ritual, in the actual rite of the liturgy, we have procession and reversion embodied in the sacrificial acts, because the sacrifice is offered, and when it's offered to the god, it rises through the daimons to the god, and then the energia of the god impregnates the material substance, and when we consume it through the reversion of offerings, we're literally consuming that the body of the god itself. So the theophagy is something that embodies both procession and reversion in itself. And if you go even further with it, the impulse to perform the sacrificial act originates in the deity. So we have the procession of the impulse to complete the sacrifice, which originates in the deity, and then the priest performing the sacrifice, and then the deity receiving the sacrifice, and then we receive the sacrifice back into ourselves, and we receive the deity into ourselves. So it's a really amazing actuation of the idea, and we see that in the Egyptian cannibal hymn. We see it in the Dionysian mysteries. So this is what detractors of true Christianity, sacramental Christianity, authentic Christianity, don't seem to understand, is that it is the continuation of a tradition that precedes it.
That's right. And even in Christ's sacrifice, it's really a combination of a number of different forms of sacrifice, both in ancient Greece and in ancient Judaism. So in that, Christ does fulfill this role as the sacramental sacrifice. And I personally I think that's probably the best way to comprehend it. But when you talk about the divine coming to us and us sending up to the divine, I read something really great in Frithjof Schuon, who was a traditionalist, brilliant man. And he was talking about, I think it's in James S. Cutsinger's collection of his Christian writings, but he says that we send up our aspirations in the form of prayers and offerings and rituals. We send up our aspirations to the gods, and in return, the gods send inspiration in the form of possessions and oracles and things like that. And that's what inspiration means, to take the spirit inside one.
Yeah, like respiration. It has to do with the pneuma, the divine pneuma, which enters into our psyche and animates the vital winds of the soul, causing a circulation of the divine energies within the soul, which in turn activate the latent divinity of the human, which is the microcosmic representation of the macrocosmic man-god, the anthropos.
Which makes it easy to see why it was so important for Iamblichus to maintain that we really are down here,
And before I lose the thought, I just want to mention, too, that another amazing innovation that Jesu instituted was this bloodless sacrifice, because not only, as you said, it is a continuation of Hellenic and Judaic forms of theurgy, and I think it could be argued that even the Judaic forms of theurgy arose as a result of contact with the Hellenic mysteries. Which I mean, the Passover, for instance, actually didn't occur until after the Eucharist, the time of the Eucharist. We know that now for sure through scholarship. But be that as it may, what's even more interesting to me is the fact that we have a logos sacrifice. Christ is the logos, the word, and that's a bloodless sacrifice. And where do we see the spoken sacrifice? We see it in the Hermetica. we see the sacrifice of speech being a wholly and truly pneumatic sacrifice. Yet that sacrifice of speech, because when we understand that the logos sacrifice is a hypostatic sacrifice, that the logos it's a pleromic sacrifice, then the necessity of a material sacrifice, it becomes unnecessary for the theurgic rites.
At least in that context, I think, yeah, it
Yeah.
does, and you really see this kind of unpacked, spelled out in Dionysius the Areopagite, the pseudo Dionysius. You'll see him, the scholastics call him, but he put so much emphasis on that silence beyond speech, and without really understanding what speech was in that context, it's really difficult to grasp what he's getting at. But I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Well, we even have the aeon sige in the mysteries of the gnosis, which is a aspect of the transcendental mother.
Mm-hmm. Hecate in the Neoplatonist writings becomes Suke, which I think is a beautiful correlation. The way Hecate is viewed by most practitioners, even today, is so far removed from her high status and among the Neoplatonists and the practitioners of these Chaldean, quote unquote, Chaldean rites.
Could you elaborate on that?
On Hecate's role?
Yes, and how and the difference between her role in the telestic rites of the Theurgists as opposed to her role in the current modern Instagram world of faddish, performative, pseudo-paganism.
In modern, we'll just say witchcraft, she's kind of become the goddess of witches, and I think that's fair so long as witchcraft is placed in its proper context and not in this kind of dark and creepy aspects of it. And she does have that because the role she plays in ancient Greece is she holds the keys that keep the Titans inside of Tartarus, the deepest corner, the deepest pit of Hades. And she shows up in the Eleusinian mysteries as being she's viewed, there's different myths, but she's either viewed as the one who helps Persephone get out of the underworld. She's viewed as a helper to Demeter, and some, she becomes the very psychopomp that carries her across that threshold. The more popular version has Hermes accomplish this, because he's the psychopompos par excellence that carries the souls of the dead into Hades, and takes them to the ferryman that gets them in. And it's very important to understand when discussing Hades that the conception of it was very much that what got in there didn't get back out, and what was in there didn't get out except on certain occasions when Hermes escorted them there. So that really is important when understanding the significance of the Eleusinian myth. But she's the keeper of Cerberus, who, just like her, he guards the gates of Hades itself, and that's her kind of her pet. So she naturally gets associated with these kind of dark underworld things. But in the Neoplatonic tradition and in the Chaldean oracles, she becomes more than that. She's not just the liminal goddess that separates these two domains as a guard and as something scary. She literally becomes the carrier, the buffer between every single one. The Neoplatonists align her with Suke, but if you look in the Chaldean oracles, she shows up in more spaces than that. She doesn't just act as a conduit between nature and Nous. There's a second Hecate. We could call it a second one. We could call it another function of the same one, but she's also between the one and the nous, between the monad and the nous. So she becomes this liminal figure that transcends and allows us to transcend those boundaries that are self-imposed in a lot of ways. That we need to impose these limitations on these ideas to make it make sense to us. But in practice, it's by virtue of Hecate that we can transcend them. And I think that's a much more wholesome view of what she does in this tradition than the way she's seen in modern practices of witchcraft. And I have lots of friends who are practitioners of witchcraft, and I think there's a lot of good things about it. But I don't think that view is particularly helpful or even fitting in a lot of cases.
Well, also, I think that your point about these things that we can't fully understand is important, because the scope of this reality surpasses our perception and our ability to intellectually conceive it, which leads us to a sort of the only way to really grasp it is by a type of meditative absorption and like agnosia. In the Greek, the sort of unknowing, where you transcend the limitations of your own perception and consciousness, and you can only do that through the aid of the divine, leading you beyond yourself to have the cosmic vision. In the oracles, it's spoken of the cosmic womb of Hecate and the triple girdle of Hecate, which are the boundaries, you could say, ring pass knots. And I think it's interesting because her girdles are serpents, and that definitely is consistent with the symbolism of the Ouroboros as a representation of limitation and time. And her triple girdle, as you so eloquently stated, she stands at the boundaries between each of these levels of reality. And so her triple girdle, that's one, each of those serpents in her girdle represents a boundary between a higher and lower reality.
Very well put. Yeah, I agree. I think you stated that very succinctly.
And we've been touching on it, but I'd like to maybe dive into it a little bit more specifically. The idea and the differences. And I like this in your book that you point out kind of this evolution of the pre-Socratics and the Katabasis, I'm not saying this correctly, and the anabasis, the difference where there's originally this idea of descent into the underworld as kind of this spiritual journey, and that becomes more of an ascent later on with the Neoplatonists. Would you mind talking a little bit about that? Sure,
yeah. So in the pre-Socratic days, and pre-Socratic is really not a fair term because it's an umbrella term to address what are sometimes very different ways of looking at the world. But at the same time, there's a lot of crossover. And the acquisition of divine knowledge in the time of the pre-Socratics, prior to Plato, basically, the acquisition of this divine knowledge happened in a katabatic descent into the underworld. And they would do this ritually by retreating to caves. We see this with Pythagoras. We see it with Epimenides, where they would spend sometimes decades in these caves in the underworld, symbolically. But not all of it was symbolic. When we look at Parmenides, for example, he really says that, that basically the ground opened up and he went into the underworld and met this goddess there who at a three-way road, a crossroad, but three ways, which is a symbol of Hecate, he meets this goddess who gives him this new picture of reality, of the world. And it's often stated that Parmenides is the father of logic. That's fair to a degree, because I do think, prior to that, it does look like the rationale behind behavior at the time wasn't necessarily logos, but mythos. So, today, of course, in complex studies of logic, there's all these equations to prove what logic is and things, but we don't need a notebook and a pen and a calculator to determine whether or not a given action is logical. It's natural to us. We can look at something and we could say, oh, that's not logical, or it is logical.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems very like we take that for granted to a degree. But prior to Parmenides, if this is really a new thing that he brought, well, prior to him, the world doesn't turn on logos, but mythos. So the way you determined how rational a particular behavior might have been in a given scenario is more to say to yourself, what myth am I participating in? Am I acting out? What myth am I repeating? And what behavior, once you know which myth you're kind of living in, then what's the best course of action based on a precedent by gods and myths. Now we don't know for certain if that's how they viewed the world, but I think that's if he is the father of logic, is a pretty profound revelation that he brought that back. But at the same time, when you read his poem, there's nothing logical about it, and it's a view of the world that kind of, it's where we get this notion in Platonism that which is thinking is also for being. And so it tells us that not only are our thoughts real somehow, that they participate in something real, but we ourselves are thoughts, and that there's very little, if any, gap between these, between thinking and being. And we could spend hours just on that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's interesting to me is you're talking about the way that it's how essential it is to discern the myth that is influencing the pattern of our lives. And that really is related to the theurgic process, because the henad that's at the root of the soul, from which the soul proceeds, and in which is clothed the soul as a garment, that the myth associated with that deity literally becomes a formative, you could say, subtle structure in the life of the person, especially as that deity becomes activated in the life of the person. Carl Carreñu talks about this in terms of the archetype and the ectype. The archetype is the influential principle, and then the ectype is the imprint, or that form that is really, you could almost say, it's the shadow of the deity cast upon the life of the person and upon the fate of the person. And that's why it's so essential through this theurgic process to come to know that divine principle from which we personally proceed, because different choirs of souls are associated with different divinities.
Almost like if you're familiar with Kurt Vonnegut's writings, where he talks about the chorus, the different souls that are here for the same purpose, but might not even know one another, but they're all participating in the same reason for being here. And Empedocles is another one that, while he himself doesn't discuss a descent to the underworld, it's clear from his fragments that he was preoccupied with it. He talks about bringing back the strength of a dead man from Hades, and when the symbols surrounding his death, for instance, in one version of his death, he throws himself into a crater in Mount Etna. The crater is the volcanic entry point, but this becomes an entry to the underworld, an entrance point to the underworld. And the crater itself, if you're familiar with the Platonic writings, with Timaeus and with the hollow flank in Hecate's thigh in the Chaldean oracles, this crater notion is very specific to both Hecate and Suke, which is, like we said earlier, is personified, anthropomorphized as this goddess figure. And when it erupts, it spews out a single bronze sandal. After he throws himself into the volcano, it erupts. Well, that single sandal is referenced at least twice in the Greek magical papyri in terms of Hecate, that her symbol, her synthemata or symbola, is this single bronze sandal. So in the pre-Socratic times, with all of these major pre-Socratic philosophers and poets, divinity was contacted through a descent. Now, when Plato comes along, he reorientates this notion of soul flight. And I like to point out that it is soul flight. We still see it in shamanic cultures where modernity hasn't completely overtaken it. This idea of the soul being the center of the individual's thoughts and emotions, whereas the further back we go, even in Homer, it looks like the soul is this shade, this echo of the self that gets quieter and dimmer as time goes on. But by the time we get to Plato, the picture of the soul changes and the orientation of that soul flight changes. The soul becomes the very center of the individual being that then casts off the body like a garment or something. And when he does this, at the same time, he allegorizes Hades. And in Plato, Hades becomes where we are now. And the descent into Hades from true life becomes the allegory for how we got here, for incarnation. And so once this was done, naturally, there's nowhere to go but up. You can't go down any further if this is the bottom of the barrel that we exist in.
Well, and that is so significant that you're saying that. We see this again. We see this recapitulated in the writings of Paul and in primitive Christianity, including Gnostic Christianity, where this world is definitely referred to as Hades. And so there again, we have a precedent in a very long mystery tradition of understanding this world, this realm, as Hades.
That's right. And
it puts Plato a spin. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say it puts an interesting spin on the story of Persephone as well, and makes me wonder, is life really death of spirit, and the physical death, more of a life and birth idea.
Right. When you look at some of the forms of the Sophia myth in terms of Persephone's descent, but instead the incarnation of a soul here, it all of a sudden makes sense. And Christianity is absolutely rife with Platonism, and it's what I believe its true form, its earliest forms. And a good example is when Christ is performing the Last Supper. And he says to them, "This do in remembrance of me." Well, the word he uses for remembrance is a conjugation of anamnesis. So the anamnesis being the divine remembering, one's divine origins, one's soul origins. Any educated Greek at the time that heard him say that, it's almost like a meta language, because by saying that, he evokes all of Plato. They would have said, oh, he's talking about Plato. He means that this ritual is going to cause me to have divine remembrance.
Gnosis, right. Yes, exactly. And that's consistent with the Iamblichus, who literally says that the enactment of the divine rites, the telestic, the theurgic rites, are gnosis.
Right. That's a great point too. Yeah, it's often overlooked. And your mention of Paul, I mean, that's spot on. It says that he goes to the third heaven. Well, this is a different model from the seven heavens that has the Ogdoad beyond it. The way in the Paul tradition, it's looked at as Suke encompasses all of the seven heavens. Then, well, that means that's the first heaven, and the second heaven beyond, or depending if we want to call sublunary space a heaven. But what Paul is implying by going to the third heaven is saying that he went past the first level of Suke, past the second level, which would be Nous, and then united with the third heaven, which would be the one, or if we're going to say sublunary counts as one, that he made it to Nous. And united with the demiurge. But in either case, I think it's important when bringing that up to point out that he didn't go to the third level of the planetary spheres. He went beyond the planetary spheres in either way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
The 9 becomes 3 for him. And Dionysius, I think he doesn't spell that out, but he does make it make more sense. And Dionysius, the teaching is that he converted after hearing Paul give that talk at Mount Ares. So that's why Dionysius is immediately seen as a continuation of the Pauline tradition and the inheritor of it. And he really does keep theurgy alive in the Christian tradition. He even refers to the miracles of Christ as theurgy. He uses the word. And this modern Christian traditions have just gotten so far away from that model, and it still lives in a lot of Gnostic Christian traditions. But then at the same time, I feel like the Gnostics, not all of them, had a really full picture of what Plato was saying. That the demonization of the demiurge is a good example. The demiurge in Plato is the nous, whereas in a lot of these Gnostic traditions, he becomes Yaldabaoth, the blind idiot god, created by Sophia without the permission of her consort. And I think all of those myths are useful, but it's such a different picture and a radical departure from, I think, what was happening in Hermetism and in some other Gnostic sects.
So well said. And what's funny is we're kind of Iamblichus fanboys on this podcast, as you probably have already picked up.
I'm in good company.
And Iamblichus, he's amazing, because if you read him, you get it all. You get it all. You get Neoplatonic theurgy, you get the mysteries, you get Hermetism, and you get Gnosticism. Iamblichus discusses the ontological placement of the archons. He talks about the multiple demiurges in reality. He talks about sacramental theurgy. So I feel like Iamblichus, the depth and breadth of his mind is staggering to me. And it's like when you read De Mysteriis, you see that he is really trying to address every single one of these issues, which is really the work of a hero priest.
It's incredible. And it's fair to even call it Hermetic. It opens with his discussion of all true priests being priests of Hermes, no matter what tradition. So right at the beginning, right off the bat, he's aligning what he's saying with Hermetism.
Now let's unpack that, PD, because you're a great person to maybe say, well, so what do you think he means by that? All true priests are priests of Hermes. Why?
Well, I think for his view, so with everything becomes generalized, and I don't mean that in a bad way. When we're talking about uniting with the one, with the monad, well, the sun itself becomes the vice regent of that. It's no longer just a heaven in the progression. It is in one sense of a model, but when we're talking about the perfect symbolon of the one here, the sun naturally fits for that, and it becomes the model for that ascent. Well, Hermes is the one that goes back and forth between that. He's the one that, as we said, it becomes daemons in the older tradition, like when we look at Plato's Symposium, where Diotima, she says that a daemon is anything that exists between man and the gods. And then she goes on to say that Eros is a daemon. Well, Hermes becomes I don't want to say archetype, because that could be confusing. He becomes kind of the catch-all for anything that goes between two things. And so by aligning all priests as being priests of Hermes, I think he's basically saying that when we make these sacrifices, the guy we're handing them to is Hermes, even if it's a specific daemon that descends from a different Syra, or these chains that descend from the one. and the way he's looking at it is we're all, when we act as priests, we're acting in concert with Hermes.
Well, the very act of priesthood is doing Hermes, is
Hermetic.
acting Hermes.
Right.
Yes. Priestcraft in itself, sacrifice in itself, is Hermes. Hermes, there are two beings in the Greek, in the Hellenic understanding, that are associated with sacrifice. And it's been suggested that they may actually be two names for the same god in a Titanic and Olympic form. But Prometheus and Hermes, because you could even say Prometheus is the Hermes of the Titans. And then you start to see an interesting correlation between Odin and Loki. But without going there, because that's way off of what we're talking about, the Hermes is said to have instituted the tradition of sacrifice among mankind. And also Hermes is said to have instituted to have given mankind fire. And so the fire of Hermes, which is transmitted, I would say, is the fire that Heraclitus speaks of, which is the supercelestial flower of fire, the fire that girds the universe and unites it together, the pneumatic fire of the nous. And and what is the fire but the sacrificial principle? The sacrifices that are passed through or put into the fire. So the fire and the sacrifice are primary, and those things are primary to priesthood. What I'm getting at here is that if you look at one of Hermes' names, Hermes Angelos, Hermes the angel, he's the angel of Zeus. And the angeloi, the angels also precede Christianity. An angel is just, when we're talking about the procession and reversion, the angels, the daimons proceed from the divine into matter, transmitting the life of the divine into matter, and the angels bear the souls of the heroes and the substance of the sacrifice up to the divine realm. And Hermes is the archetype of all angels because he's the angel of Zeus. He's the first angel.
Right. And angelos means messenger also.
Yes.
So that's exactly what I'm getting at, that all daemons become mercurial messengers in a sense. And this idea of him being the angel of Zeus, we see the same thing in Egyptian religion. It's almost a trope at this point to say that Hermes and Thoth or Tahuti are the same being in different countries. But even when we look at the texts, he's called the heart and the tongue of the highest Egyptian deity in the creation myth. So he's the mouthpiece. And when we say the heart, for us in modern metamodern man, we think of the brain as the source of our thoughts, but that's not really how they looked at it back then. All the sense of self was more at the heart of the person, the heart of the being. And Jeremy Nadler, he has a great discussion, and he's so incredible when he talks about the compartmentalization of different bodily senses in the body, how part of what we would think of as an emotional or intellectual process are allocated to the feet or to the hands or to the chest. But this notion of Thoth being, or Tahuti being his tongue and his heart, it really expresses the connection between the tongue and language and speaking to the self. And at one point, Proclus, he's talking about something that Socrates says, but he draws a connection between the Greek word for to call out, meaning, to project myself outside of myself and the sound of my voice, and beauty itself. Because the words in Greek are very similar. But what he's basically saying, he's saying that the smell of a flower is that flower beyond itself. It's calling us, it's alluring us to it, which that space between that's being covered by the voice, by the word, that's where Hermes also becomes the logos. He's equated with the logos a lot, especially in alchemical traditions. But that space that's being filled between the caller and the called becomes, I think, the way Proclus puts it is it becomes a mean, like a ratio between the two. But I find that really a fascinating way to look at it. And then he goes a step further and equates that with beauty, with the form of beauty, which in later Platonism becomes the good itself. So that Hermes becomes both the word spoken, he's the voice, he becomes the very embodiment of beauty in this regard. I think when he's talking about the call, I like to replace that with the scent of a rose, because it's easy to think about that as alluring, whereas with speech, it could be deterring or alluring, depending on what we say, what we choose to say to a given person. But with the rose, I think it's a much clearer concept because it's always calling us to it. And it's that divine reversion that's implied there.
Nicely put.
Yeah. And I want to mention too, if you look in the 8th book of Moses in the Greek magical papyri, Hermes is actually described during the genesis of the cosmos as a god holding a heart in his hand. And then there's also a hymn to Hermes, Lord of the universe, whose temple is the heart. So this concurrence of Hermes with the heart, and if you look in the East, in Indian traditions, the planet Mercury, called Buddha, is associated with the Anahata chakra, the heart chakra. So it's a very consistent association of Mercury with the heart, and this may be strange to people who consider him a merely intellectual god, because it goes back to an earlier tradition of really the heart being the true mind. And what's interesting about this too is biologically they've found in the past, decade or so, that there are neurons in the heart that we do think with our hearts. And to the Egyptians, during mummification, the brain would be extracted through the nose and thrown in the trash, fam. And the heart, though, was very carefully preserved because that was seen as the seat of the soul, and that's why the heart is the ib or the ab. And if you reverse that, it's the ba, the soul. So the heart soul or the soul heart is so important. And Hermes is essentially daimonic, angelic nature, I think, is important. And that's why the Platonic idea of the archetypes, I think, is essential too, because people need to understand that all of the daimons and the angeloi are cast from the dye, the mold of Hermes. So they're all his form. And when you understand that, then you can understand the way that their forms being cast from his form are resonant with him.
Yeah, and the association with beauty, and the heart, even the natural associations for us today for those kinds of concepts are Venus, the planet Venus, which harbors those kinds of ideas. But in Mesopotamia, it's not Hermes who has the ability to descend into Hades and come back out. It's Inanna who is able to descend, and she is representative of the planet Venus. So the crossover here is that both of those internal planets, and by internal I mean in between Earth and the sun, not beyond Earth, whereas other planets have the natural orbit that the sun follows. They rise in the east and they follow the ecliptic and set in the west. Well, Mercury and Venus don't do this. They have what appears to be an irregular orbit because of their placement inside between the sun and the earth in our actual orbit. But this positioning, when you look back at the earliest astrological writings, there doesn't seem to be a distinction drawn between Venus and Mercury. It looks like they confuse them as being one planet that shows up at different spots at different times, a morning star and an evening star. And Venus itself meets this criteria. She will rise in the east for a time, and then she doesn't seem to keep going over our heads into the ecliptic. She dips back down. But that's what they're telling us with that myth of Inanna when she descends into Ker, the Mesopotamian underworld, in order to confront Ereshkigal, who sits on the throne of the underworld. Well, Ereshkigal in the Greek magical papyri is combined with Hecate. And one of the spells, she's called Hecate Ereshkigal, or the other way around. I forget. But all of these associations are very natural when you know the history behind them. And we might, we're spanning countries and epochs, but it's all very natural symbolism that once you understand how it fits, it makes sense to call Hermes the beautiful and the heart, and Tahuti, there's the tongue and the heart. And it doesn't just have to be an intellectual concept that Hermes is just sort of like a science whiz. He transcends that in a big way.
That's so well said. And our entire work with this podcast is dedicated to him. And I've said, attested to, borne witness to, and will continue to personally state that Hermes is not just a concept or, this far-off idea or this aloof deity that might be interested if you make the right sacrifices. Hermes is a very real presence, very caring God, very real God. And he's known and described as his Jehuti, Thoth, as caring very much about human beings and being compassionate to our plight, to the plight of the incarnate, and being a sure aid to humans. And also he's an aid to heroes, which again, Neoplatonically and theurgically is interesting because the theurgic art is the telestic art, is the heroic art. Mm-hmm. So it also is, mystically saying that Hermes is the aid of the theurgists, but he's also the aid of the common man. He's also the aid of the person seeking employment. He's the aid of the heartbroken person. He's the aid of those seeking protection while they're on the road. So in him also is that essentially daimonic character that bridges extremes of, you have this high exalted, the angel of Zeus, he's in the highest level of the cosmos. He connects us to the most subtle and refined realities and to the cosmic nous, which surpasses our understanding. And yet, he's also present here on earth with us, able to assist us in the necessities of our daily vicissitudes.
I love it. Yeah, that was spot on. I couldn't have said that better.
Nice. And so to bring us back down to earth a little bit, I know we wanted to touch on this before we wrapped up, so I want to make sure we leave enough time. The picture of theurgy as a practice, I'd like your thoughts on it, and maybe we can go back to what we had talked about earlier with the Homeric epics and Proclus, and maybe talk about Achilles, the theurgist, and sure. how theurgy looks on a practical level.
So that is the big question, and really what I think is the beauty of my latest contribution in that book. The theory behind theurgy is basically what we've been discussing here. This ascent of the soul up into the supernal realms and uniting with a daemon or a deity or the demiurge or the one. But it's essentially this notion of the self almost expiring and it's becoming a god. And I think it's important too to really spell that out. It doesn't mean that you're uniting with the god in this sort of sexual way. It means that you become the god. It's a potentially very scary idea that I don't think a lot of people have a good grasp on what that means. But in terms of how it's done, well, for the soul to ascend, you have to die. And in most of these traditions, these kinds of experiences are reserved for the deceased. After they die, they go through these things. But for the theurgists, they said, no, I don't want to wait. I want to do that now. And so the notion of a death ritual seems natural, at least in the beginning. So, and I can't discuss this without going back to Socrates in Plato's Republic, saying that we have to do away with these ancient poets because they paint pictures of the gods that are not necessarily appealing. And he says, no, we have to stick with these myths. These are sacred, and I'll tell you why. And he goes to tell what Syrianus taught him. Syrianus was so loved by Proclus that they were actually buried in a twin burial together. And he saw him, Proclus is incredible, the most prolific Neoplatonist there was. And he's always tipping his hat back to Syrianus. And what he had to say was that the ritual takes place and is spelled out in Homer. And the word he uses is mimesis. You mimic. To mimic this is what theurgy is. Well, what exactly happens in Homer? And the way it relates to what Socrates was saying is Socrates points out that he says, for example, one of the bad things that these poets have taught us is that Achilles took 12 prisoners of war and threw them on the funeral pyre. Well, the funeral pyre he's talking about is, I believe it's in book 23 of the Iliad, where Achilles is fighting alongside his companion Patroclus, his best friend, very close pair of friends. And Patroclus is murdered. And Achilles is overcome with grief. And he lays down and falls asleep and dreams that the soul of Patroclus comes to him out of the underworld and basically says, look, I am miserable down here. I belong with the heroes, not down here with these normal lesser souls. And if you would just get up off your butt and perform my rites, meaning this funeral ritual, I will have the opportunity to get out of Hades and go be with the other heroes. And so when Achilles wakes up, he wakes up with a start and he jumps up and he says, okay, I have to go do this ritual. And he proceeds to build this big, what's to be a funeral pyre, stacking up all of these logs and making this huge, almost like a tower. And at the same time, there are games going on where golden craters are one, crater being like a giant mixing bowl for mixing wine at a symposium. So there are games going on. It becomes almost like the Olympic Games, and it's happening around this funeral for Patroclus. Well, he throws those 12 men on this pyre, and Proclus says, well, what this really means is it's a reference to Plato's Phaedrus, where the gods are said to move in a train. All 12 gods are circling with Zeus at the head, and they're all gods and supernal beings in this model are orbiting. They make circles. Circles, it's seen as the most perfect form. Whereas here on Earth, we don't necessarily make circles. We do all kinds of erratic movements. But the perfect motion for a soul in this model is this orbiting, this circular motion. And that's what the gods are doing. They're following each other in this train. And so Syrianus says that these 12 prisoners of war, each one of them becomes a token of one of those gods. He's building the train for Patroclus's soul to follow, to get in line with. And at the very beginning of this ritual he's performing, he can't get the pyre lit. It keeps going out. So he makes an invocation to the north and the west winds. And he needs them to blow to this wind to blow to kindle this fire. And Proclus explains that this is because these have to do with the cleansing of the soul vehicle, the okima. And I don't think we have enough time to totally go into what the okima is, but it's a fascinating concept of a soul vehicle. And Okima is a chariot. So in Timaeus, when Plato has the demiurge construct the world, and then he attaches to each star an Okima, a little chariot that makes it move, that animates it. Anima meaning soul. And of course, Socrates in another place gives the allegory of the soul as a charioteer pulled by a good horse and a bad horse. So the soul vehicle came naturally out of their reading of Plato. And so these winds are specifically to cleanse the soul and its vehicle. And at this point, he gets the fire lit, and they pour offerings on this. This is when he offers the 12 people that Socrates opened this discussion with. He puts their bodies on the pyre, and Achilles takes a crater, just like what was used to mix wine with other drugs and to dilute it at a symposium. He takes one of these giant craters, fills it with wine, and then he takes what's called the double cup, this two-handled cup that is sacred to the Dionysian tradition and the mysteries of Dionysus. Instead of getting these really thin, easily spillable cups and drinking from a community crater like at the symposium, and the Dionysian rites each had their own cup that was very stable, not meant to spill, and they get their own allotment of this wine. So this is their share of wine, and this is important understanding what Achilles does next. So he proceeds to circumambulate this fire with Patroclus's body burning on it, and he takes the double cup and fills it up with wine from the crater and pours it onto the fire. Now, the crater is what Plato has the demiurge use to mix soul, to mix anima mundi, which again, remember, that's Hecate in the Chaldean Theurgic tradition. And Hecate is said to, again, have a hollow flank in her hip, which is a euphemism for her vulva. But it's this cup that she has from which gushes soul. So this crater becomes all soul. It becomes the anima mundi, the complete world soul. Whereas each cup that he's filling and pouring out comes to signify Patroclus's individual share of soul. So one is Proclus calls one the fountain of souls, which is the crater, and then his individual share is one at a time ladled out and poured on this fire. Now, the act of pouring it on the fire naturally will create steam as soon as it hits. And this process of converting it to steam would seem to me to be a natural indication of it becoming pneuma, of transmuting matter into spirit to send it up on the heat of these flames. And he does this all night long. And finally, at the end of this scene in Homer, he looks and he sees the morning star rise, which is again Venus. And Venus in the ancient astrological traditions, she's the psychopomp, not Hermes. And they were often conflated and thought to be one star. So just as when Inanna, in the form of Venus, she's able to descend into the underworld, which what we're saying is Venus, instead of traveling overhead, it's able to go back under the horizon, enter the underworld, and then it gets back out again, which nothing it can do without a psychopomp. It's a magical action, because once something gets in, they don't get out without the psychopomp to guide them. So when he sees Venus, the morning star, rise before dawn, that's his signal to stop, that the ritual's over. This obviously isn't spelled out in Homer, but my reading of it is that signaled to him that with Venus's ascent out of the underworld, so too did Proclus ascend and leave that underworld territory, leave Hades, in order to travel with that star, as though following in the train of the gods to go join where he should be, which is where the heroes are, or if we want to say that he's forever orbiting with the other gods in their train, both are fine. One would be a religious model, the other would be a Platonic model. But in either case, that signals to Achilles that Patroclus's soul has left Hades, and he's been successful in this ritual that he's been performing.
Nicely put. There's so many things we can unpack with that. I mean, we could talk about the mixing bowl that you find in the Hermetica. We've got, the Mithras liturgy, which we can branch off and talk about. But I think this is really an interesting idea. I especially like the implication that this doesn't have to be done just for rituals for the deceased necessarily. Like, this is kind of a model for the ascent that an embodied person who's still, of this world can go through to kind of shed these layers that are associated with the planets, shed all these layers and shed all this baggage, and essentially die in a way to kind of find that higher self. And personally coming from a Mahayana Buddhist perspective, one of the main things there is that everyone has this Buddha nature inherently, but all the layers need to be carved away in order to find it. So this is a really interesting model for living rather than just for dying. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's what you're describing is catharsis, this purgation of all the dross. And this is really where theurgy and alchemy cross over. They seem to be different traditions, but their goal is the same, because they're both trying to capture something of a pure form. Now, where the theurgists do it with their practice of animating statues, for example, they're taking the suntamata and symbola of the gods, which would be, if we were talking about the sun god, we're going to choose something from each kingdom of nature that doesn't represent that sun. It is that sun, that god on all of these planes, almost like a fractal is one way you could think about it. But we're going to take gold from the metal kingdom. We're going to take roosters and lions from the animal kingdom. From the plant kingdom, we'll take sunflowers and heliotrope. And all of these things are combined to gather the little bits of the god up, almost like he's been dismembered and we're remembering him, to use a play on words Utsavinis uses. We're remembering the god by building this statue, this animated statue. And by taking the little bits from each kingdom, we're getting all the different parts that have been scattered around in order to capture something of the whole form. Whereas in alchemy, the goal is to purge everything except the form, to just leave that essence, and to take away anything superfluous that is not that form. And those things we're taking away are that dross. Those, in the Corpus Hermeticum, it becomes they're like tunics in the Poimandres, where this exact kind of model and ascending through the spheres is described. Each of the vices of the planets are cast off and the soul goes up a little higher. So in this model, when the soul incarnates, it's descending through these 7 planetary heavens, just like Inanna descended through 7 gates when she went into the underworld. And with each of these descents, these levels of descent, the body acquires a planetary tunic, for lack of a better description. And that tunic has both the virtues and the vices of each planet. So if we're talking about Venus, the virtues might be beauty and artliness, but the vices might be lust and indulgence and things like this. So it gets both of them.
It's a dance of the 7
That's
veils.
right. So when Inanna descends to the underworld, just like the Dance of the 7 Veils version of it, she casts off one layer of clothing until she's totally nude. And Inanna does the same. It's not all clothes. She casts off her breastplate and a necklace and a crown. But the idea is that when she gets to the base, to the bottom of this, she's completely nude. And this is a mirror of what the soul goes through. And I think the best way to think about it is, well, she's a god and we're humans. So the god naturally has to descend to get down here, if we're going to take a Platonic interpretation, whereas the soul, being down here, has to ascend and go through these levels. But as it ascends with each planetary level, it casts off that vice. And in some teachings, it even casts off the virtue. Both go, because both are part of that planetary tunic. And it finally gets light enough to where it leaves the realm of fate, which is what those planets signify. They signify the soul's fate, and enters the Ogdoad. And the Ogdoad, it's the realm beyond causality, and it's where the daemons exist. So when you mentioned earlier about the daemon, well, the way of calculating the name of your daemon and then only working with that daemon is another way of doing the same thing. It's supposed to relieve you of the effects of fate and causality, because now you're acting in concert with something that's beyond them. And this is kind of Zosimos's thinking. He was the first alchemist. He was definitely a hermetist. But he's got this student named Theosabia who's learning astrology from the Egyptian priesthood. And he's telling her, no, astrology, that's how you get trapped in fate. That is fate.
Right.
You know? And she says, well, but they're just teaching me what she calls propitious astrology, as in how to determine elections, to decide the best day to do certain things on. And he says, I don't care what they're teaching you. If you cast a horoscope for an election and then do what it says, guess what? You've just enmeshed yourself further in causality, whereas he's saying the philosopher's stone, which in this case would be an analog to the daemon, has the capacity to free the soul from that causality.
Right. And Iamblichus says very similar things as well. And I mean, they were essentially contemporaries. And another plug for Uta Hanegraaff's book, he makes a strong and interesting point that of Iamblichus and Zosimos both being Hermetists.
Right, absolutely.
Which makes complete sense to me, 100%.
So if you were to give advice to aspiring theurgists seeking to establish their own effective practice in our time and age, what would be some guidelines that you might impart onto them?
I think I would probably echo the sentiments of the late Algis Eustovenes when he said that theurgy, to the degree that it is theurgy, is demiurgy. And so he's saying to mimic the demiurge. And, well, we obviously can't see the demiurge. What does that mean? It means to not be a radical exception. Don't try and just think up something to do and do it. Do what everything is already doing. The best advice I could give would be to try your best to get up when the sun rises. Rise with the sun. Try your best to go down to sleep, or at least stop your daily activities when the sun sets. And get yourself in tune with natural flow, because we are natural flow. We have this free will component that allows us to say, no, I'm not going to catch that wave. I don't want to surf today. But theurgy, effective theurgy, is surfing. It's catching a wave that's already coming, not trying to do something contrary to it. And you can imagine that swimming against a wave would probably be one of the most difficult activities you could choose. Whereas catching that wave and actually saying yes to the world, I think that's an important aspect of it. We are so free to say no. And I don't mean this in terms of letting someone take advantage of you. I just mean in terms of saying yes to the world and its processes and its cycles, and understanding that you are a reflection of that and integrating yourself to it. I think that is probably the best way to get involved in theurgic practice. And go get yourself a copy of the almanac. They put out every year, the Farmer's Almanac. I tell this to all my students. Every year, get a copy. Now, it doesn't mean what's in there is what's going to happen to you next year, but this is an indication of the way the cycles are taking place where you are in your hemisphere. And I think foraging is a good practice. Learn what plants grow at what times, and in that process, learn what planets or gods they're sacred to. Because in this worldview, the sunflower doesn't represent Helios, it is Helios. So understanding how the gods manifest where you are in your region that's breathing the same air you are, learn that and get in tune with it. And I think that's probably the best advice I could give.
Fantastic and beautiful answer, actually. Not what I was expecting, but makes total sense, and I really love it. In addition to getting that almanac, I would also encourage people to go out and get your book, as I mentioned, Theurgy, Theory and Practice, the Mysteries of the Ascent to the Divine, Homeric Epics, the Chaldean Oracles, and Neoplatonic Ritual. Really fantastic book. Great work. Congratulations on it.
Thank you so much. It means a lot to me.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the time and effort you put into this, because there's not much out there.
It's an essential contribution to the emerging field of theurgic studies, and it's a wonderful resource to have on the shelf. Before we close, I just want to actually mention something I like that you included at the end of the book, which is the Homeromantion. If you want to talk about that for just a little minute.
Sure. I think, earlier we mentioned that we send up our aspirations, in the words of Frithjof Schuon, we send up our aspirations to the gods in the form of prayers and offerings, and they send down their inspirations in the form of possessions and oracles and the like. And this is an oracle that is directly involved with Homer, with I think the majority of the phrases that are in this oracle are phrases spoken by gods or heroes. So they're divine utterances. And you have to keep in mind this really pretty modern concept of having a holy text, a sacred writ, with the Torah and the New Testament and the Quran. Prior to Homer, that didn't exist. There was no compendium of divine utterances. Everything was in this kind of bard tradition where it would be sung and there'd be music and it'd be interactive. And Homer and Hesiod were really the first ones to sit down in that region and say, well, let's write it down. Let's get all these myths down on paper. And in that process, they naturally informed all of their successors of how that previous tradition viewed divinity and divine actions. And so what this oracle does, it calls for 3 dice. You could use one die. And back then they were using sheep's knuckles, which are naturally 6-sided. And they would call it a cipher. These same ciphers show up in Gnostic initiation rituals where they're ascending through the heavens and they have to show the right side of the cipher of the die to the archon to get into that level of heaven. So these die have very sacred significance already. We kind of just associate them with gambling and games, but they're sacred tools. And each one, just like a modern die, is numbered, and if you roll 3 and they land in a line, you collect up those numbers, which each one is naturally going to be between 1 and 6. For all of those possible outcomes, this oracle has a statement, an utterance made by a hero or a god, and that becomes your oracle for the day. And it's followed with a little outline of what days are good to divine on, what days are not good, what days you can only do it in a certain time of the day. And I should mention that those aren't the months. So if it says the first day, it doesn't mean January 1st. It means the first day of a given sign. So closer to the 19th to 21st of a month, the first day of that individual zodiac timing is how I understand it. But I've used this oracle for, let's see, going on 3 or 4 years now, and I'm just astounded by it. What I do is I let it. I'm still not completely settled on whether an oracle, when you do it this way at the beginning of a day, whether or not it predicts your day or programs your day. And I don't think there's a way to know that, but I do know that living in the rhythm of this and letting the divinity come through, the element of chance. And if you've read Carl Jung's commentary on I think it's a foreword or an introduction to the I Ching, where he talks a lot about the element of synchronicity in that, and how we're really participating with something beyond ourselves by doing an oracle. And this Homeromenteon, meaning it's the same root as mentis, which is to be an oracle. It's also the root of words like manic, because of the frenzy, as Agrippa would call it, the frenzy that you have to go into to have access to these statements. But in this, you don't have to be in a frenzy. You can just throw your dice and figure out the numbers and go look in the book, which is actually the text in its entirety I reproduce in my book, but it comes from the Greek magical papyri. So, definitely get yourself a copy of that if you don't have it. The only thing that I changed was I changed out the translations of the phrases from the Greek magical papyri to those of Richmond Lattimore, who I adore. I think his translations of Homer and Hesiod are my absolute favorites. So I changed those out just simply for that reason. But it's a very simple oracle that I find to be one of the best I've ever worked with, and I've worked with many.
And something about an oracle like this, it brings to mind the Oracle of Ifa, which is used in Yoruba-related traditions, Yoruba-derived traditions.
Ifa is fascinating. It's very similar to geomancy, but with the benefit of oracles with it, oracular stories and statements.
Yeah, it's amazing. And because it's part of a living spiritual tradition, there's a technique to it too, where, okay, say you use an oracle and you get a fortunate outcome, great. But say you get an oracle and you get a misfortunate outcome, well, then what you do is you perform the appropriate sacrifice, the appropriate Ibo, and that can offset the misfortune or change your fate. And I think that it's useful. I have an astrologoi. I have another knucklebone divination oracle from a similar time, and it states the gods which are associated with each oracle, and that's very useful, because then you can go, okay, well, this says something that's not so great. Well, I'm going to make a sacrifice to these gods and ask for them to provide me with an adjustment to my fate.
Very similar to the thwarting angel concept in the Testament of Solomon. You're going to try and propitiate the bad thing that could happen. And I think the sacrifices, they can both help you avoid a negative outcome and help you encourage a positive one, depending on what your reading was.
Like make the most of
right.
it. Yeah, for sure.
I've personally, I don't know much about Ifa. I've read a couple of books on the practice, and on Santeria or Lukumi, what in Cuba they call regla de ocha. But I am involved in Palo Kimbisa, a form of Palo Mayombe, which is regla de Congo. So one is Yoruba based, the other is Congo based. But in Palo, we don't have anything like Ifa. So I personally haven't worked with it, but reading about it, it is incredibly fascinating.
Now, one thing I want to mention, I think it's appropriate in closing, is that Hermes being, and this is so interesting because he's associated with the heaven within the cosmos, but then he's also, his true heaven is the Ogdoad, the realm of eight, the eighth plane, the eighth realm, the eighth climate, the eighth heaven. And that's amazing because the hometown of Thoth in Egypt is literally called Eight Town.
And Mercury is also the eighth Sephira in Kabbalah. Oh,
yes, Hod. Yeah. And so he is above fate and was understood and is understood to be able to adjust fate, to change fate.
That's a great point.
So if you see that there is a potential for you to incur some kind of misfortune, you can supplicate Hermes and ask him to change your fate. That's why, they even say in the one hymn I quoted earlier, the Moirai's fatal thread and dream divine you're said to be. In the Moirai are the fates. And he's said to be above them. So he's one of the only gods that can actually circumvent Himarmene. And when we talk about fate, what we really mean is the operation of the cosmic rulers, the planets, the archons.
Destiny. That's right. Fantastic point. And I'm glad you brought that up before we close, because that is a great point, that we can outstep fate. And it seems what I said earlier about my advice, that to participate in the way things are, I don't think those are at odds with one another. We're always going to be subject to our destiny, but I think there's a lot to be said for saying yes to it, even if it seems like something negative. It in itself can be an act of worship. But then again, these oracles, those are also divine. And if we can get a leg up on something that's going to take place, that maybe we can be alerted to it to some degree, I think that's incredibly beneficiary. And they do exist in a number of traditions. It's not like this is unique to Greek or Egyptian religion. This oracles as divine utterances from the gods, to bring up Lukumi again, they'll take the cowrie shells, and those are known as the mouths of the orishas, that when they cast them, those are simply because of the element of chance involved, it makes it divine. Because of course, if we could interfere with it, it's no longer divine. It's something, it's techne. But that element of chance is something we have no control over, just like our destiny, so long as we don't know about it. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's a great point to leave it on.
So where can people find you if they want to get in touch with you, to learn more about what you do? Do you have a website, perhaps a Facebook page, and do you offer any services to people, things like that?
We're working on a website. I have a small consulting company. I work with individuals on existential and metaphysical things. We work with dreams and what we can do throughout certain life scenarios. And there will be a website for that soon. The company is called Helios Consulting, LLC. But until I get that website up and running, I try to stay active on social media. I'm not the best at it, but I do try and get on about every other day at least, and post something about what I'm researching and what I'm doing, what I'm writing. And you can find me. All of them are under my name, PD Newman. And I'm glad to discuss this kind of thing with anyone. I mean, you guys probably know just as well as I do that my wife is sick to death of hearing about all of this stuff. So I do relish the opportunity to discuss these kinds of things with individuals who might not even really know what it is, but that does give me an opportunity to kind of revisit some of the basics, and really my passion is in teaching and kind of just being that finger pointing at the moon, to borrow an Eastern phrase. So yeah, reach out to me, and I'm glad to discuss this, all of this kind of stuff.
Awesome. Well, thank you once again for coming on the show. I'm sure everyone listening got a lot out of it. I know we did. And just keep us updated on what you're doing, and we can always alert people to it through our platforms.
I sure will. Thank you guys for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, it's been so wonderful to have you. It was a fantastic discussion, and I loved every second of it. It's so nice to be able to talk about things like this with somebody who cares as much about it as you do.
Likewise, you guys are doing the Lord's work. Keep it up.
What an excellent conversation on the subject of theurgy, don't you think, Dom?
Yeah, I'm always interested in conversations about theurgy, so I'm game at all times. But this one was particularly interesting to me, mainly because it had a fresh angle. PD brought kind of a fresh take, which was nice on theurgy, because the big question is always, how was theurgy practiced? And everybody just shrugs and then moves on. But he had a pretty compelling argument to make on what it could have looked on based on actual source texts. So I found that really compelling and interesting. So I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, I'm grateful for this. It was such an intriguing conversation. And it's great because, as you know, we really want people to embrace experimentation with theurgy. We want people to engage with it in more than just an intellectual way. We want people to try to experience what the reality of theurgy is because of the effect it has on the soul and the possibility of divine contact that can be made, or contact with the daimons. These things make it worth it. They make even the baby steps when you're first starting out have value, because sometimes profound things are in the simple. What an erudite guest. He really understands the subject matter in detail. He's excellent at describing it, at articulating very, very deep ideas. I feel like he did so well with making these ideas accessible and interpreting them in a way that made them understandable to someone who might be coming from a more basic place. His grasp of the Greek philosophical tradition and its roots in a really shamanic Katabasis, and then this developing into the anabasis of the later Theurgic philosophers is intriguing. The arc of development is so interesting to me, and it links together the entire philosophical tradition, really. So we have a book to review today, I believe, right?
Yep, I'm going to field this one. I think you've done the last one or two. It's called The Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way. It's a philosopher / I guess you could say priest character from 2nd century CE. It's Nagarjuna's Mula Madhya Maka Karika, and I don't know if I said that right. It's a juggernaut as far as a philosophical text, and it's extremely interesting, but also very difficult to understand because Nagarjuna's mind was so profound. So this is actually a translation and commentary by J. Garfield, and it's an excellent commentary. Mr. Garfield shows a deep understanding of the material. Essentially, the main gist of the book is sunyata, which we've talked about on this show before, or interdependence, essentially. That's discussed in the book. And the two truths doctrine of Nagarjuna is discussed, which essentially talks about reality as being both empty in an ultimate sense, but also admitting that there is a conventional reality that is just as valid. And in talking about the middle way, in addition to that particular idea, it also addresses the idea of eternalism versus nihilism, how both extremes could lead you astray, and the middle path, the middle way, is the ideal path to take, and that's what Nagarjuna tries to lay out in the book. And again, the way he lays it out originally is very dense and could be very difficult to read. Definitely not for a beginner, but Mr. Garfield makes it extremely accessible and understandable in a way that you would not be able to grasp most likely on your own unless you were a real scholar of the subject matter. So great book, very insightful, especially if you're interested in Nagarjuna and early Mahayana Buddhism. The book is The Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way, translation and commentary by J. Garfield.
Thanks for that. Very good, very good. Well, folks, we appreciate you tuning in for this program. Keep in mind also, we have several interviews on different aspects of Theurgy on our podcast. It's one of the primary focuses. So if you're interested in this subject, take a look in many of our prior episodes. We have had Gregory Shaw on the show. We've had Angela Voss. We've had
Christopher Plaisance.
Jeffrey Cooperman.
Or Kupperman.
We've had Edward Butler on the show. So if you guys are interested, we have lots of material here. And I think that if you listen to all of these as a series, you would learn a lot, and you'd be able to jump right in and start doing the things. So just a recommendation. It might be something interesting for you.
Yes, absolutely. Anything else?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you in the next episode.